Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to the Inkwell Library. I'm your head librarian, Elizabeth, and I invite you to relax and enjoy the works in our institution. Thank you for coming to our first ever weekly story time. I hope you enjoy yourselves. Before we start, however, I want to tell all of you about our very unique library. Unlike other libraries, we don't acquire works for our collection through the traditional means. Instead, we offer writers the opportunity to submit their own works to be featured in our collection and read during our weekly story times. For our first ever story time, I've pulled 2 works from our archive. My theme for this week is fear, and I've selected a real screecher double feature for us tonight. Our first work comes to us courtesy of Bridie McInerney and is titled Trypophobia. Please enjoy. As a child, I don't really think I was afraid of anything. I mean, I had the usual fears, being alone or in the dark, or losing my favourite toy. But as I got older, I think I felt that anxiety began to set in. It was like the world had shifted in hue overnight, going from safe pastel colours to bright neon in seconds. Being afraid just became the norm. I'm afraid of a lot of things. Talking to people, calling someone on the phone, but I don't think I ever really expected to be afraid of the holes. My stomach would roll and churn at the sight of small holes, or when I looked at an otherwise smooth surface, lined with little pinprick holes or dents. It was debilitating. I've been told it originated to keep people safe from illness and disease. The small holes packed close together mimic the way skin warps, the rotting of flesh as disease carves small holes into skin. Or at least that's how I feel. I find it hard to look in the mirror nowadays. I hate looking at my pores. I can't get to the toilet fast enough. Truth be told, I thought it was because of bees. Bee sting allergies run in my family, and all my life I was told to be careful around beehives. Those pock-marked palaces of wax caused me such immense discomfort that I couldn't stay near one for long. Maybe that was just because I was afraid of the pain. Who knows? Who cares, even? I can still recall that video I saw of the man with the little white holes on his face. I think it was some prank video. I felt the tug in my stomach, the settling of the familiar anxiety overwhelming my senses. I couldn't explain the tears, though. Why was I crying? No one else seemed to feel this way. Why me? I know other people who feel like this call it trypophobia. That label doesn't feel right, though. Collections of pipes don't reduce me to tears, and despite my fear of bee stings, I never felt particularly off about honeycomb. The triggers of my fear always come with some mortality, holes in bone, the skeleton of a decaying leaf, and those sickening, sickening pits in skin. My anxiety was telling me that I was making it all up, and I admittedly started to listen. I felt bad about feeding that needling voice in the back of my head, but I couldn't help myself. It wasn't even a bad day when it happened. Quite the opposite, honestly. School was out that day due to some sort of infestation, and my friends and I decided to make the most of it. Our city spring festival was on, and though some of my company was less than desirable, the weather was pleasant and the flowers were in bloom. It was still spring, though, and as the sun began to set, a chill made its way through the air. Not wanting the day to be over, we decided to stop by a museum on the way home. The closest one was the War Memorial, so that's where we went. Truthfully, I don't think that place is many people's cup of tea. It's not really somewhere you go for fun, but a few of my friends are big history buffs, so it wasn't a chore. I'm not the biggest fan of wartime history, so that meant I was stuck walking with a couple I wasn't super close with. The two of them decided that a wartime history exhibit was the perfect place to canoodle, so I got out of there pretty quickly. I did enjoy walking alone. The museum was pretty empty that time of day, and the air was cool and dry. I continued to walk, absorbing the years of history I hadn't experienced since the days of a primary school trip. The exhibits had changed since the last time I visited. As I wandered the exhibits, I felt a heaviness began to settle in the air. I had wandered into a smaller gallery room in the World War II section. I couldn't recall ever coming to a room like this on any of my school tours, but as I looked around, I began to understand why. I'm still not able to fully comprehend what it is that I saw on that pedestal, that amalgamation of warped metal in the centre of the room. It may have once been a machine or part of a vehicle, but it now sat in this cold, empty room riddled with bullet holes. The protrusions around the edges spiraled and twisted, creating a crude map of dark rust across its surface. The holes seemed stained with age or something else. As I stared into those crude spirals, my stomach began to curl. I don't know what possessed me to do what I did next, but when I think about it, I don't think I had any other option. I had to go closer. I had to. I needed to understand what it was about this monstrosity that compelled me ever closer. I reached out, desperate to run my fingers over the rough, rusty metal. Even though, I know it can't be true, I swear to you that there was something moving inside that thing. Something was moving, pulsating inside that twisted shell, and it began to leak. The holes started to move. They were beckoning me closer, calling to me like a song, to come touch them, to feel them, to know them. I felt as though the metal was scraping my brain, looking for a way in. I heard the screams then, the pain. I don't like to think about what might have happened if that alarm hadn't gone off. My friend found me sobbing in the corner. She said she got bored and come to find me when she heard the alarm. I wanted to scream at her to get away from this room. But I noticed that she didn't seem to have looked at the pedestal, seemed to be deliberately avoiding acknowledging it. She helped me up, and together we walked to meet up with everyone else. And we went home. I don't think my friends liked to talk about that day. I think I scared them all a bit. It's still there, though. That mass of twisted metal. I see it whenever I close my eyes. I think about going back sometimes to check whether, any of it was real. But I don't think an alarm could save me this time. I don't want to become another Scream. Well, I know where I want to avoid at the War Memorial now. Our second tale was submitted to our collection by an anonymous author. This second work is titled, It Grows in the Dark. Thanks again for agreeing to meet with me. You're one of the only people willing to hear me out about this. Sorry, I'm not here to waste your time. I'll start. It's weird, though, how many things we simply don't think about until we have to. Whether that's bills, a deadline, or any of the other innumerable things that exist around us that are taken for granted. I've lived my life not thinking about things until I have to. Bills showing up in my mailbox always surprised me. And when I was in school, I was a chronic procrastinator. That was reflected in my grades too, but I never thought about those till report cards came out. I suppose that's part of the reason why I was one of the only young people to stay in town after graduating high school. All my classmates moved to bigger cities to study for their degrees that would keep them coming back till they were at least 40. The only real jobs in my town are working the checkouts at the local supermarket, slinging patties at the numerous fast food franchises dotted around the main streets and lining the nearby highway, or sweating up a storm doing manual labour at a local farm. If that doesn't appeal much, or if it can't pay those impending bills, your only other option is the abattoir, half an hour's drive out of town. After being fired from the McDonald's on the highway, the abattoir was where I was headed. Given the aging workforce of the place, they were all too happy to hire the only 21-year-old that had applied for 10 years, despite my admittedly less than stellar employment record. Fast food never suited me anyway. Customers, especially those coming from big cities, tend to be irritable and impatient. And when those customers are your ex-classmates, they can get a bit smarmy about the fact that they're not there to catch up and are simply passing through. I figured that the old folks at the abattoir wouldn't have such a superiority complex. And if they did, it would be more acceptable to take my frustrations out on a pig or a cow than an ex-classmate. The abattoir is an ugly building. I reckon that's why they built it so far away from where people would actually choose to live. The front of the building can almost be considered as visually appealing, if Gothic Victorian is what floats your architectural boat. But the additions to the building make it look grotesque. Behind its almost stately entrance looms several large red brick boxes that house the majority of the abattoir's machinery and production. I think the only reason the front has stayed the same since it's been built is because it's heritage listed, because it's not exactly very practical. But I still remember the first time I walked in that door, the vertigo of walking through the low ceilings of the original structure into the towering halls of the warehouses nearly made me fall over. When the foreman showing me around noticed I had stopped, he remarked that he hadn't seen someone react like that in years, and that in a month or so I'd stop feeling that way. The tour was honestly pretty interesting. While most adults I knew worked at the abattoir, I'd obviously never been. It wasn't exactly the sort of place that held a take your kid to work day, and my classmates only spoke about the abattoir when trying to scare younger kids. I apparently had taken that talk more to heart than I thought, though. It was significantly cleaner than I'd imagined for a start, and despite the building's obvious age, the machinery and facilities were pretty spotless. The tour covered all the basics, and while some aspects of the process were pretty confronting, it wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be. The foreman explained that this particular abattoir provided a significant amount of meat to the nearest supermarket chain, and that meant there would be some high expectations for me when I started my position. I assured him that I was capable, and received a pat on the back for my troubles before he sent me home. My first day at the abattoir was surprisingly mundane. When I was hired, I hadn't been assigned any particular position, and ended up spending most of my day cleaning. It was explained to me that while they were very happy to receive a new body on the floor, all of the relevant positions had already been filled by existing employees. My job was to learn how to do everything, so that in the event of a worker's retirement, they had someone trained up and ready to go quickly to keep up with the demand. Therefore, until that happened, I was to shadow senior employees to learn, and when I wasn't able to do that, well, I was a more than capable cleaner. During my first few months working at the abattoir, I learnt how to do pretty much everything. It was hard and disquieting at times, but I found comfort in the dullness and mindlessness of the majority of the work I was doing. Slicing the cuts of meat was one of my favourite jobs. I found creating the uniformity of the cuts to be satisfying, and when I would visit the supermarket on the weekend, I would take a bit of pride in knowing that I'd played a part in the process. I secretly hoped that one of those workers would be the next to retire. I also really prayed that it wouldn't be one of the guys on the killing floor. I never shadowed there, probably due to some work-safe policy, but even going near the door made me feel dirty for a few hours. One other place I never ended up shadowing was the receiving area, where the animals were kept for being slaughtered. I did find that a bit odd, but I didn't care to think about it too hard. Probably would have felt just as dirty as the killing floor anyway. Didn't end up mattering much, though. I quit before anyone else could leave. The first time I heard the noise was on my third day. I was working in the weighing room, shadowing that room's foreman, when I noticed a soft squeaking noise, then a quiet pop. I brought it up to the foreman, but he brushed me off and told me it was probably just a machine in another room that needed more lubrication. The noise wasn't loud or particularly grating, and was pretty easy to ignore while working. I didn't notice it again until almost a month later when I was working on the processing line for the first time. It was louder than it had been in the weighing room, and again I brought it up to the foreman I was shadowing. She brushed me off in a similar fashion, telling me that, she'd let maintenance know. The more I heard it, though, the more it started to rub me the wrong way. I've worked jobs where I've been around machinery before. I was in a rural town, for crying out loud. I went on school trips to local farms. I've driven a forklift illegally in the back lot of the supermarket. But I have never heard machinery make that kind of noise. Unlubricated machinery tends to sound grating and sharp, the kind of sound that makes everyone who hears it cringe away and cover their ears. This sounded almost exactly like the kind of squeaks that shoes make if you would run on a well-waxed indoor basketball court. And the popping. I have never heard of machinery popping like popcorn. If the machinery is making those kinds of noises, I genuinely don't think it would be safe to work somewhere like that. But no one else seemed at all concerned. I asked a few of my co-workers about it, and some had never heard it before, but those who had seemed nonchalant. I'd only been working there about 5 months at that point, and I didn't want to fall victim to tall poppy syndrome, so I made the conscious decision to stop thinking about it altogether. No one else seemed concerned. Why should I be? I didn't know what was making the noises, sure, but at the end of the day, it wasn't really any of my business. I continued like that for another 2 months, and maybe if I hadn't seen what I'd seen, I'd still be working there. I must stress, this job wasn't a bad one. I was good at it, and as I said earlier, I tend to roll with the punches and not question things. But whenever I heard those noises, I'd just be filled with such a sense of unease. 7 months into working at the abattoir, I finally learnt what was responsible for the noises I kept hearing. Sort of, anyway. It was a Sunday night, and I was packing my bag to head into work on Monday while my mum and dad watched TV. There was a rerun of an older BBC documentary playing. It wasn't really anyone's thing. Not many people care about rhubarb farming these days. But it was late, and no one really cared to change the channel or turn it off. I stopped what I was doing, though, when the farmer started to describe how rhubarb is farmed. Did you know that rhubarb is one of the only plants that grows in the dark? Darkness produces sweeter, more tender and vibrant rhubarb compared to growing in the light. She called it forced rhubarb. I was transfixed. Maybe it's because it reminded me somewhat of my work at the abattoir. That's when I heard it. The documentary crew was led into the building that housed the rhubarb patch, and the farmer told everyone to be very quiet. The soft sounds of squeaking and popping that had infested my thoughts for months filled my home. Rhubarb made those noises. Why did rhubarb make those noises? I stumbled over to the couch as the farmer began to tell the documentary crew that rhubarb made those sorts of noises due to how fast it grows. I felt the blood drain from my face as she explained how a stalk of rhubarb can grow up to 5 centimeters in 24 hours, and that's what causes the noises. They sounded almost identical to what I'd been hearing at work. I ran out the door, not stopping to let my parents know where I was going, got in my car, and drove like a bat out of hell down the road to the abattoir. When I parked and stumbled to the door, I was surprised to find it unlocked. I pushed the heavy thing open and started to walk quietly through the cavernous halls. Every sound of my shoes on the linoleum sent a shiver up my spine. I made my way to the weighing room and listened closely. I needed to know where the noise was coming from or I'd go insane. I stopped as close to the center of the room as I could and closed my eyes. I heard it, loud now that I was the only one present. That chilling noise echoed through the dead chambers of the abattoir. Eyes still closed, I walked towards the sound. Every so often, I had to feel my way through a door, but I refused to open my eyes. It was dark enough that I could focus on the sound with my eyes open, but I feared with my eyes open, I'd see something I wasn't ready for. Hands outstretched, I kept walking. Although my Monday through Friday had been spent in this building, this night it became a labyrinth of brick and metal filled with uncanny squeaks, pops, and the cloying smell of lemony sanitizer. Panic was thrumming through my veins as I desperately tried to be quiet. My mindless following was brought to an end by a sharp pain in my left hand and the sensation of warmth trickling down my outstretched arm. My eyes shot open to see that I had wandered onto the killing floor and I'd stuck my hand into one of the blades. I clamped my hands over my mouth to keep myself from screaming. I didn't know if I was alone. There had been no other cars parked outside, but the door had been left unlocked. And if I wasn't alone, I did not want to be found. The smell and taste of blood began to fill my mind as I desperately tried to calm my breathing. The sound was louder now than ever. I had to be close to its source. None of the machines were even on. So whatever it was that had been haunting me, no one I'd talked to either knew or wouldn't tell me. Eyes wide open now, I turned my head towards what I now knew as the source of the noise. The door that led from the killing floor to the receiving area loomed at the other end of the room. The receiving area was the only area of the abattoir I'd never been, and here it was, taunting me with its eerie noises. A new sound had joined the pops and squeaks that thundered in my skull. Squealing. Whatever it was on the other side of the door was alive, and it was in pain. Every fibre of my being was screaming at me to leave, but my morbid curiosity compelled me forward. I'd never wanted to understand something, to know something, so much in my entire life. I pushed on, trailing blood from my injured hand across the pristine floors. Summoning all the courage I had left in my body, I pushed open the door. The receiving area is the space of an abattoir where the livestock are kept before being sent through to be killed and processed. I knew that. I also knew that the abattoir had received several trucks of pigs a couple days before. I knew that behind the door were animals. I really did. But when I looked through that doorway, all I could see was rhubarb. Squealing, twisted rhubarb made to look, act, sound, and taste exactly like pigs. I could see them growing. The swelling mass of bodies before me. The sounds they made were the ones that had been living in the dark corners of my mind since I started my work. Their bones creaked and squeaked as their mouths were filled with the liquid that rained down from the pipes on the roof. Their joints popped as they twisted and contorted under the transformation they were undergoing. I'd been surprised to see how big some of the meat cuts we got were. The writhing halted when the blood from my still dripping hand began to pool on the floor. The engorged mass of flesh before me erupted into a frothing, filthy frenzy at the smell of fresh blood. Their caterwauling called for blood, the blood that awaited all of these amalgamations at the end of the production line. I don't really remember what happened after that, I gotta be honest with you. I know I made it home in one piece, and that Dad called the ambulance. Mum told me I was catatonic for days afterwards. They still don't know the truth why I ran off that night. Or why the first thing I did when I was coherent again was quit my job. I'm sure they think I had some sort of breakdown. Why else would their son run off in the middle of the night, come home covered in blood, quit his job, and immediately spend all his savings to move away? I couldn't stay, though. I couldn't look at any of my co-workers in the eye, let alone return to work after what I saw. I don't know how many of them know the truth. I didn't know how to tell them myself, though. That's why I came to find you. You're an investigative journalist. You can get into that abattoir and get some evidence of what is happening there. It can't be legal, what they're doing. Please, you have to try and expose them. Maybe then I can go to the supermarket again. Did you know I can only shop at the farmer's market now? And I'm vegetarian, if you can believe it. Please, find the truth. One of my new neighbours brought apple and rhubarb crumble over last week. I don't think she understands why I threw up at the sight. Please, you have to help. And with that, we wrap up our story time this week. Thank you all so much for listening. I do hope that you take the time to come back next week. We will be here at the Inkwell Library every Tuesday at 9 p.m. If you have a work that you would like to submit to our collection, please email us at stories@ucfm.com.au. I have been your head librarian, Elizabeth. Good night.